Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, thank you for attending the credentialing or the credential quality standards. I keep on calling it the credentialing quality standards. So I want to thank you for attending. I know there's a lot going on and it's very difficult to be on any virtual session these days. I know I try to avoid them these days. So let's begin here. Again, this is a credentialing quality standard. You could see the two graphics. There's actually two tracks, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There's going to be more than two tracks as we continue to develop them. So I first want to say thank you to these individuals. This all began through conversations with Lynn Anderson and I, and she runs the ophthalmology licensing group. They're optometrists and things like that. So at Jacopo, and we just had conversations maybe 3-4 years ago of how the standards, the current standards out there are very good, but they're just sometimes they lack some practical perspectives from our point of view and from what a lot of people who are folks like Lynn or Jen or Dana or Liberty. And when I represent the client, sometimes I don't know what some of these standards actually mean 100%. And then if you do a deep dive, you realize that nobody understands some of this stuff and there's multiple ways to address it. And that's okay to have multiple ways to address it, but we want to give more guidance. So I want to thank Lynn. Liberty was very helpful to actually developing these standards. I began the draft of it, and then Liberty reviewed it and revised it, added some things. So there was some substantial changes that she added to it. So her fingerprints are all over the standard, which is really, really very thankful for. Jennifer also has some fingerprints on the standards. Jennifer Naughton, who's at the Actuary Society these days. So she was very, very helpful in helping review it and looking at it. NASFA was very helpful in actually being one of the two pilot groups. NASFA and Jacopo are the two pilot groups, and they're accredited in the program, and they're accredited on both operations and psychometrics. So Dana and Susan and Margot, thank you for all your help on this. So I just want to get the thank yous out of my way here, and really indebted to those individuals. So why did we really create this in the first place, this standard? Well, there really there are like 5 reasons I have, but I was part of, I'm an ANAB, ANSI, ISO assessor, and I also was part of a lot of the assessments on the client side and getting them through it. And I also was a certification manager that had to get through it. I was also did the food safety one that ANSI had, and that was my first exposure to it almost 15 years ago. So to any accreditation process, besides the one in my clinical psych program as a PhD student, I was there many years ago, like that was 20 years ago, so now I'm dating myself. So there are really five reasons why we decided to do this in my conversations with the folks who helped me develop it, the standard. One of them is, why don't we just make the standard prescriptive, and why don't we just ask the question and make it a question-based standard? So every single clause in the standard is a question. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And why not rely on attestation on a lot of these things? Why do we want to look at a lot of times we're not qualified as financial experts to look at financials, so why do we need to look at those sort of things? And bylaws and things like that, how do we know the bylaw is really fake? Those PDF documents look fake all the time when I look at them. So there's a lot of things that that we can just we could be less invasive, especially with privacy issues coming aboard these days, more and more so. And then we looked at why not focus on tracks rather than like requiring every single group to go through psychometrics and operations and quality and all sorts of things, financials and all these sort of things. So we decided that will do psychometrics and operations, because most of my clients want to just get validated or accredited around psychometrics. They want to make sure that their psychometrics are okay, because there's a lot of quality management and accounting practices and operational practices out there. And, you know, ANSI has, ISO has the 9001 that you could do. And there's a few other groups out there that does quality management, operations, and accounting and things like that. And the two other reasons is, you know, if we make this prescriptive, why not have a way to determine whether someone wants to file for what we call an exception to the clause? It could be that the exception is that, you know, for instance, we have brand new programs that they don't meet the maintenance requirements because no one has gone through the maintenance requirements at this, you know, when they first launched and got the credential in the past year. It's going to take 3 years for them to get that to that point. The other thing is, let's say you have a unique standard setting or passing score process that's really new and you published it and things like that. You know, your psychometrician on your team might have done that. And it's brand new, and you published it. So that's where you want to file for exception, because now you have evidence. You know, there could be studies, internal studies, white papers that your psychometrician did or some other researchers did around some process or procedure. And then the other piece of this is educative and being consultative. So we want to provide you with case examples. We want you to have a lot of conversations with accredited groups. We want to facilitate those processes. We want to answer your questions. Any of the assessors can recuse themselves and become your consultant, which is a really unique proposition. I don't think the other groups have considered that, but that makes it really easy, because you've been working with that person maybe for 2-3 years as an assessor, and now their cycle is over, or they're they could recuse themselves, or maybe they're brand new and that, you know, and they went through your program as an assessor and you really need a lot of help, so they could recuse themselves from that and become your consultant, and we would assign you another assessor. So that makes things a lot easier. And again, practical is why we all began this through conversations, this standard, why we created it and why we're doing it. So that's really and it fits within one of our values, which is practicing the practical at AERE. So the standard really, again, this is in the foreword of the standard, or the introduction of the standard. This is word for word. It's really trying to meet the practical needs while still maintaining the quality around psychometrics, education, research, and quality management standards. Now, the other piece of it is, when we were talking about this, we really did not want to work as a competitor to NCCA, their standard, or ASTM, or ANSI, or ANAB, or ISO. What we really wanted to do was really complement rather than compete. And what I mean about complement is that there are certain areas that we don't go in depth as ANSI or NCCA may, and they had the reasons for this, but we don't really need to go in depth in terms of, you know, let's say a threat analysis. We don't really need to look at every single body and see how you manage your threat analysis. You know, we think that, you know, conflicts of agreements and NDAs and or conflicts of interest and NDAs should cover that essentially. And how you do that, that's up to you. We just want you to know that that you're doing it through attestation, but we don't need a formal threat analysis or conflict of interest analysis, those sort of things. So, those standards are more in depth in those certain areas, whereas we're trying to look at the practical, relevant, and critical areas for your program. And again, this is really designed from folks who have been certification managers, leaders, and psychometricians in the field, and they've worked for certification groups more than anything. And let's move on here to the next slide. So what does the standard do for you? So we did talk about some of the reasons that it could really help you. But one of the things that's really, and we'll get into the fees, we're going to be very transparent about that towards the end of this presentation, but it's a lot less money than the current standards. It's also resource sensitive. Now that we're focused on the critical areas, it's going to take less time and less people, and we're going to be really educative, so you don't have to guess what the standard really means. We'll have resources and training aids and things like that to help you through that. So we want to actually reduce your time on how long it takes. We also, when you go again for getting reaccredited or your surveillance, whatever you want to call it, it's every 2 years and rather than every year. You know, a lot of times there's a lot of small groups that take 2 years to get the number of people to do their item analysis and things like that. So we were looking at that in terms of looking at how sensitive we should be to the organizations and their resources. Again, we have those dual tracks. So we have the operations and psychometrics tracks, and we're going to deep dive into that a little, what's that covered. And then we have, again, we have very prescriptive clauses that's going to, again, attach the resource sensitivity. It's question-based. You know, it's a yes, no, or you could file for an exception. And again, there's the educative piece. We're going to, you know, walk you through each clause if you take the workshops and things like that. And then the assessor can recuse themselves or suggest individuals help to overcome. The assessors can do that. I can do that. But they can't, you know, they can't suggest methods without recusing themselves to get you over those clauses that you might have difficulty with. So again, it's 2 tracks. There's the operations and psychometrics track, and they all are question-based. An example of the question-based is in the job analysis clause, there's clause 1.6, and we asked the question, did the credentialing organization conduct the weighting exercise using SMEs and or mathematical methods? You could say yes, no, or you could even file for an exception. I don't know what the exception would look like, but there could be an exception to it. So those could be those sort of things. And then if you continue with the question base and you move over to trust, where we're looking at self-attestation or your organizational attestation, attesting that you do have these things. So we would ask you, does the credentialing organization have documents pertaining to the formation of the credentialing organization? And you could say yes, no, or exception. I don't know why you would, maybe you might not have the documents if it was international, the right documents, but there could be an exception around that. But the point here is that if you say yes, we're not going to ask you for the evidence in this case. The job analysis does ask you for the report and where the weighting would be occurring in the weighting in the job analysis report. But for the organizational and financial requirements in 2.1, we don't ask you to provide those evidence. We're relying on you, and you sign an agreement that if a third body wants the information, that's between you and them. We just understand that you are claiming that you do have these things and you could prove it, that you do have it. We're not going to look for the proof itself on some of these things. And that was a way to like not get into, you know, knowing how much you make and things like that. We don't think we need to know that, and it's not critical to know that. Maybe the formation of the organization could be critical, but we didn't think it was as critical as other things. And then consultation, we talked a little bit about that. So there's psychometrics so this is one track, CQSP, and then there's CQSO, which is operations of the credentialing quality standards. So this is where the tracks come in. So the psychometrics track is 11 clauses, and it actually goes across the life cycle of how you would develop a certification or credentialing program, a certificate program as well. You know, in the case of a certificate program, you may not use a job analysis. There could be other ways that you come up with your list of learning objectives. But for the most part, we're looking for something that has certain requirements. And these are some examples of what the clauses would be looking for. You know, inputs, were there any inputs to put together the job analysis? Sometimes there isn't, it's just SMEs. Did you use subject matter experts? Were they qualified and representative? How would we know that? What type of research methods you may have used to do the job analysis, methods to write the competencies around the job analysis. You know, how do you write task statements and knowledge statements? Were there any linking exercises, weighting methodology, and test exam specifications? If you don't understand this, that's fine. You know, we'll have trainings around this in the future, but it's just going through the credentialing process of what the assessors would look for in these areas. This is just a description of the clauses that are underneath the job analysis clauses. So these are not the clauses themselves, but it's describing all the clauses within these sections of the standards. So item development would be the next thing. Once you have your job analysis, you get into item development. So it goes around who did you use, what were the types of guidelines you used, were you using references and rationales, and did you actually use the results of the job analysis to write your examination items? And then you get into the next step after that. You know, you get into item analysis, and then the beta, if you use a beta or pilot, or the number of candidates in your pool, item statistics, flags, types flags, status of the items, and then any type of item forensics that you might be using. In this case, you know, we sometimes do give you hints, like, you can use item drift as an example. So we're not afraid to use hints. I know some groups are a little less prescriptive there, but again, we don't care about, we want to be more prescriptive than less prescriptive. So the form analysis would be looking at the statistics around your form, like reliability, means, all these essential statistics, pass rates around the form. So that's another thing to look at, you know, for each of the forms your exam forms that you're using. And then we get into standard setting, which is your passing score studies, what methods you used, and things like that. So this is just really going down the life cycle and then equating what methods to use and scaling what did you use. And then some of the things that are optional, the translation and adaptation, a lot of standards don't have any, you know, it's built within, you know, it's not explicit in a lot of the other standards that are out there. So here we go into a little bit more depth and breadth than the other standards, which is one of the few exceptions, as well as candidate score reports. We also have a clause around that. So, and then sustainment is, how do you maintain the examination? You know, what activities, psychometric activities are performed, you know, including what were the key decisions among stakeholders, and things like that. And then this is optional, performance assessment, because if you do have a performance assessment, you do have to answer the questions in this clause. You know, that's around calibrating, how you put the rubric together, inter-rater reliability, and then in some cases, performance assessments have different scores that mean different things. So there's that, we call it passing score criteria. There can be multiple ones in performance assessments. And then you have recertification, which is required for everybody, unless it's, you know, it's a brand new certification where those people are not even recertifying it. So that's a piece there as well. So those are the 11 clauses within psychometrics. And then we move on to operations that have only 4 clauses. I think operations is a lot lighter than a lot of other groups, but we looked at 4 different areas, which is the first of one of the 4 is the staff qualifications. And if you look at it, it's really just ensuring that the organization has people that can do the work and they're qualified to do the work. And they have the sufficient support, such as training, to do that. You have your organizational financial qualifications. Again, we're just looking at attestation for a lot of these things. But then you have your vendor and consultant agreements. And then a lot of times we're looking at a public member on their board, which is really important. I know NCCA does that, so we think that's also important. So, and it was important to the development committee, but it might be that we change that later on in the future. So that could be another thing to also look at. So the other piece of this is when you look at policy qualifications, we're looking at those agreements and non-disclosures, looking at quality control if you have an internal audit process, privacy, confidentiality, exam security, proctoring, especially in this day of remote proctoring. We wrote this before remote proctoring even came out, but even test site proctoring, we're looking at both types, appeals, complaints, but we don't have a separate standard or ad hoc around remote proctoring. What we think is that if you have the right proctoring processes, they should ensure that the test is being delivered securely with the proctor doing the authentication and securing things and things like that. If we see that in the policies and we see that in the practice, that's good. But we're not going to ask you to compare the differences between test site and remote. If there is a difference, it could be that the difference is okay. We don't know that. Like as researchers, we don't know. Let's say remote proctoring does have higher score gains. Well, maybe it's because it's a self-selected group of people that score higher. We don't know. Or test site, I know when I talk to Liberty, test site folks score a little higher than remote proctoring, and she doesn't really know, but her theory is that it could be that it's just that group of people are just more serious about taking the tests and they have less distractions. So that could increase their score gains, but we don't know. So, and we may never get to that answer. So we're just ensuring that nobody can cheat via using a proctoring. So minimizing the cheating there. And making sure that the test has the right instructions and it's going okay and things like that. So again, there's accommodation, test equipment. What do you do to remove the certification holders? Do you put them on a nice website like CompTIA does and say that these people cheated and they're banned for taking a CompTIA test and they're on their website? It could be kind of looking at punitive in some ways, very punitive. And then the next thing is candidate-related qualifications. This has to do with the again, the candidate agreement, awards for candidate passing. Do they get a certificate, a digital badge? Do you have a candidate directory? And really important is, do you have the elements that would be really contained in a bulletin or candidate handbook? These are things like, how do I take the test? What do I need to take the test? Do I need my license, passport? How long is the test? What's on the test? Are there examples of test items? How can I appeal? How can I enter a complaint with the organization? Those sort of things. What's the fee of the test? Those are all the things, and we have a whole list of those things in the clause itself. So you're probably wondering now that you have the content, an idea of what's on the standard, because those are the 4 areas in operations, and we went over the 11 areas of psychometrics. You're probably wondering, okay, if I'm interested in going through the accreditation process, what does that look like? So it's on our website, but I'll show that to you in a second. So the accreditation process is really just completing the initial application, which just tells you where do you want, what do you want to do? Do you want 2 tracks, 1 track? Who are you? And collects information about, do you have a job analysis, your standard setting, those sort of things. When was it done? When was the last time it was done? In some cases, here's a clue. Sometimes we get submissions where the standard setting was done before the job analysis, and we have to ask a lot of questions around that. So just keep that in mind. Normally, that's a flag for most psychometricians. There could be a reason for it, but a lot of times the reason's not a good reason. After that, we look at it. We want to make sure you have everything. And if you're not ready, we'll tell you that you probably should do these things before you submit the full application, because if you don't have a formal job analysis or a formal item development or standard setting process, you probably shouldn't go on to step 2. So we would go back to you and say, hey, do you still want to be accredited? You have to do this, this, and this. We could do it, or someone else in our one of the assessors can do it, or one of the other folks can do it as well. Step 3 would be once we have the application completed, we have the assessors. There's one assessor for each track, so you would have the psychometrics assessor, Liberty's one of them, and the operations assessor, Jennifer's one of them. So they could be assigned as the team. Whoever's available is who we use. The assessors do get trained on the standard. Right now, I'm the lead trainer for this. And Liberty and Jen hopefully will become the next lead trainer, so I could do less of that. Step 4 is that you respond to the assessor's evaluation. They might have questions. They might say, hey, you're not meeting the standard. You go back and forth on these things. If there's an issue, I sometimes intervene and look at things. That hasn't really happened that much. But the one thing about the standard is sometimes we realize that the standard, when we piloted, we realized that the standard wasn't as clear as it should have been on how do we come up with a representative group of subject matter experts. And we decided that we will require a sampling plan, which is very different and more in-depth and more rigorous than all the other standards. But the intention is that the group would do everything they can to meet the sampling plan, even though most of the samples will be convenient for the most part. So it's just to get you thinking that, like, if you do a job analysis, you want to make sure that, if you're doctors, you want to make sure that the emergency room doctor and the family doctor is represented, and it's just not emergency room doctors, so, or it's just not one part of the world. If you're international that you're representing, it's representative in some ways, the regions and the practice areas and those things. We have like 4 or 5 areas that we'd like you to hit. It's in the standard. It's very prescriptive. So I'm often a little bit more detail than usual. So the evaluators would look at that. Then they would, if they don't have all their answers, they would conduct an in-person if necessary, or virtual, depending upon your preference. If you do in person, you'd have to pay for their expenses, their travel expenses. So that could be cost prohibitive. Step 6 is to respond to the assessor's final evaluation after the virtual or the in-person meeting. And then 7, we'll make a final decision. The assessors will make a final decision if you've gotten to that point. And then step 8 is 2 years later, you go through the full application again and try to meet the standard. So that's really the accreditation process. Now the big mystery here is, how much does this all cost? So as you remember, there's a single track. You could do operations, or you could do psychometrics. They don't have to happen at the same time. You could always add it on later. So the initial application, if you want to do 1 or 2, is still $1,500. If you do 2 tracks, it's the annual fee is $1,500, and then the flat fee for the assessors $300, and then there's the exception review. If you do file for an exception, because everything is yes, no exception in terms of your response to the questions in the application or the standard. The appeals processing and review, because if there is an appeal, it does take time to review it and things like that. It could cost a lot of money. So there is an appeals process. And then assessor on site, if you request it, it's $500 a day per the assessor. If you want to, and it includes, you would also have to pay for their travel and their lodging and meals and things like that. There is optional trainings. If you want to go to a workshop or individual or organizational training, we go out to your organization and train your staff on the standard. We would go through it in depth and tell you how to get through it and things like that. Again, we're not hiding how you not get through the standard. We want you to get through the standard and become accredited. So we're kind of like, when you do take the training, we are teaching you ways to meet the standard, and most likely you'll meet the NCCA standard and the ANAV standard in these areas, not the entire standard of that, because we don't look at every single clause for those two standards. We're not looking to meet those standards. We're looking to meet our standards. I don't know if there's any questions. I think you could put it in the question dialogue, but if you want to go to the website, our website for the standard is Credential Quality Standards, cqs.aereexperts.com. I'll put that in the chat box as well, so you can click on it. And in the meantime, if there's any questions, I'll unmute you all, and I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. Okay, so I don't know if there are any questions. Let me see if I could unmute you all. And if you have any questions, you could also put it in the questions box. Yeah, so I unmuted all of you. There are two groups that are accredited, Cynthia. It's NASFA and Chicago, and the process has launched as of, I think April 1st, we launched it. So this is all live. If you go to the website, you could start accrediting. You could start the accreditation process. Yeah. Again, we're still learning, so any comments or any ways we can improve the process. This is ongoing. This is what makes it different. We try to do ongoing revisions, and if it makes a lot of sense, we do them immediately and update the standard. So I think we've gone through 7 or 8. So Ellen asked a question: how do you see certifications using the fact that they passed this accreditation? I don't know how they're going to use it. With the psychometrics, we think it's pretty valid on many levels because we do ask for evidence of the reports, and we do have a psychometrician looking through it. On the operations, it's more self-attestation. So there could be, they're just going to have to look at ways that they can validate it further if somebody wants it. Again, if somebody wants to go through, ISO, ANAB, ANSI, or NCCA, where they're more recognized internationally, we do want this to be recognized internationally, and it has more, and they have much more of a bigger footprint than we do, since we just started and they've been around for a long time. They can, they might be able to complement themselves, with those accreditation processes. Yeah, so I'm going to put my email address in the question box because Shangwan has asked me for it. It's and my phone number. Shangwan, it's good to talk to you. I haven't talked to you in a while. Or I sent that to you. Any other questions? I tried unmuting all of you. Oh, you can unmute yourselves if you want to. And I am looking for assessors on both the operations and psychometrics. So if you want to, a lot of you know me, so you could just send me a note, and and we'll work it from there. And spread the word, and hopefully we'll get more people to go through this standard. We're very excited about it. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so thank you all for attending. Thanks, Ellen. So if you have any questions about this, I'm more than welcome to chat with you. I'm very excited about this, and again, you have all my information now, so and you always did. So let me know if you're interested, or if you want to get going, or if you want to be an assessor too. Thank you again. Talk to you all soon.